So we are here to talk about how cultural differences impact our effectiveness when we're working internationally. And I'm going to start by giving you two examples about my own clients and how they struggled with this topic. The second situation is about a French woman I worked with. Her name was Sabine. When I worked with Sabine, she was living in Paris, but she was just about to be expatriated here. She was moving to Chicago. So I spent some time with her before she moved, helping her think about how she might adapt her style to this American context. And then after she'd been in Chicago for 4 months, I did a pre-scheduled follow-up call, first with her new American boss, John. And I asked John, how are things going for Sabine? He said to me, Erin, it's not going well. He said, the problem is that I've spoken with Sabine about these things she needs to change several times, and I've seen zero effort on her part to make these changes. He said, if she doesn't start working on this soon, I don't think this expatriation is going to work out. I did, he told me, have my first performance review with Sabine last week, and I was again very clear with her. So I'm hoping to see some effort soon. So I got off the phone with John, and I called Sabine, and I said, how are things going in the US? And Sabine said to me, they are going great. She said, Erin, for the first time, I found a job that takes advantage of all of my talents. She said, Erin, I have to tell you, I had my first performance review with my new boss last week, the best performance review I've had in my career. Right? Okay, now these two individuals both had cultural differences impact their effectiveness without even knowing it. Okay, so with that, I would love to get started with our first dimension, and I want to talk with you about these terms, low versus high context communication. And just start by saying that in a low context culture, when we communicate, we assume or consider that we have a low level of shared reference points. So in a low context culture, when we're communicating, we feel that we don't have the same relationship or information or context. And because we assume a low level of shared context, in these cultures we believe that good, effective, professional communication is a communication that's very explicit. That's very simple and very clear. In a low context culture, I believe if I want you to understand blue, I have to say blue. In a low context culture, I'm taught that if I give a presentation, I should tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I tell you, and then I tell you what I've told you, right? Why do I tell you the same thing 3 times? Because everything is about the simplicity and the clarity of the message. Now, in a high context culture, while we're communicating, we assume that we have a much larger body of shared reference points. And because we have all of the shared context, in these cultures, we believe that good, effective, professional communication is much more sophisticated, is more nuanced or implicit or layered. I teach in 2 languages, English and in French, and there are these words in the French language that mean high context. We don't even have these words in English. There's this word sous-entendu. And sous-entendu means when I speak, don't listen to my words. Listen to the meaning behind my words. So it's not what I said that matters, it's what I meant that matters. In Japanese, so the Japanese culture is the highest context culture in the world. In Japanese, there is an expression which is kuki yomenai, and the expression means someone who is unable to read the atmosphere, or someone who is unable to pick up the subtle messages in the air. So in Japan, a good communicator can really pick up all of those subtle, unspoken messages. And a good, poor communicator is kuki yomenai, right? Okay, so now I'd just like to start by looking at some of these countries with you. And you can just see as you look up here, first of all, the colors don't mean anything. I just have, for example, different regions and different colors. But you can see when you look up here that all of the Anglo-Saxon countries fall to the left-hand side of this scale. The US, the lowest context country in the world, right? And then if we move over, you could see that we have many Latin countries and Mediterranean countries that fall kind of mid-right on the scale. And then further over, you would find many African countries, and even further, many Asian countries. And partially, this is linked to language. So many Asian languages are very high context in themselves. For example, in Hindi, the word kal means both tomorrow and yesterday. So you see that in the language, you have to constantly be reading the air to understand what the word means, right? Then I'd just like to get you to think about how this impacts an interaction. I had a German who said to me, you know, Erin, in Germany, at the end of a meeting, we almost always do a recap, right? First, we do a verbal recap, and then we do a written recap, and then we send that out, right? He said, now that I've been working in France, often at the end of a meeting, I'll get ready to do that recap, and my French colleagues will just stand up, and someone will say, et voilà. And I'll think to myself, but voila what? And I'll be so surprised to see that it just seems that people know what's been decided. They understand who's supposed to do what without going through all of those levels of clarity that I'm so used to. So one thing you can take away from this is that in low context cultures, we tend to nail things down in writing more frequently than in high context cultures where we leave everything open for verbal interpretation. Right? A second example, I was in China last year working with a multinational American company. And before I worked with them, the chairman of the company, who was from New York City, gave a presentation. Afterwards, he left. I was talking about this with his employees. The human resource director from Shanghai raised his hand, and he said, you know, Erin, this is really interesting for me because the whole time the chairman was talking, I was trying to make sure that I was listening with all of my senses, that I was picking up all of the levels of meaning that the chairman was trying to pass. And now that I'm looking at this, I'm asking myself, is it possible that there was no meaning? And I thought to myself that that chairman would have been very surprised to know that anybody was trying to read the air beyond his literal words, right? Now, my third example is about parenting. I had this Nigerian woman who said to me a few weeks ago, she said, in Nigeria, we raise our children to be high context. She said, you know, if I have people over for dinner and my daughter says to me, Mom, can I have another sweet? I will say to her, of course you can. But she knows by the look in my eye that I bet she better not touch that sweet. And you know, I just thought about how I raise my children. And you know, I learned this system from an American parenting book. I have sat down with Logan, who's 7 years old, right? And we made a list of all of the rules. We typed them out and we posted them on the refrigerator. And I'll say to Logan, you know, no, you can't do that. And he'll say, well, Mom, that's not fair. It's not written on the refrigerator. So you can see already at age 7 that one child is learning to read the messages in the air. And the other child is learning the most important message is the one that's written down, right, and put on the refrigerator. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just get you to think about how people complain about one another when they're working internationally. Low context people, they say that high context people are lacking transparency, that they're hiding information, they're secretive. High context people say that low context people are condescending. They talk to us like we're children. Either they're not very smart or they think we're not very smart. I had someone from Indonesia in my class who said, you know, Erin, in my culture, if we have a discussion and we on the phone and we make some decisions verbally, that would be enough for me. And then if you get off of the phone and you put into writing everything we've decided and you send that to me, that would be a clear sign to me that you don't trust me. Right? So a lot of people are having these reactions going back and forth without really knowing what's behind it. And if you think about what is behind it, I mean, just think about the history of the US, the lowest context culture in the world, and Japan, the highest context culture in the world. I mean, Japan, an island society, a homogeneous population, people living in very close proximity for thousands of years. The Japanese just got to the point that they could read the atmosphere. In the US, 250 years ago, people moving from all over the place, having different histories, different backgrounds. Americans learned if you want to pass a message, you really have to simplify that message to the lowest common denominator, right? So that brings me to my first conclusion, which is global teams need low context processes. And that's because when you're communicating across cultures, the most difficulty happens not between one low context culture and another low context culture, like Americans working with Americans working with Germans, not between one low context culture and a high context culture, like Americans working with Japanese, but between one high context culture and another high context culture, like the French working with the Chinese, because we're all speaking between the lines, we're all reading the air, but the context that we use for that communication is very different. Okay, we just about finished our first dimension, but I need to do something very important for me as an American before I move on, which is tell you what I've told you. So let me just start by doing that now. The first thing that we got already is global teams need low context processes. Fine. Beyond that, if you're working with low context people, go ahead and be as clear as you can, put it in writing, recap 3 times. Now that's fine, but what if you're working with a higher context culture? In that case, you might repeat yourself less. You might ask a lot of clarifying questions, and you might focus on increasing your ability to read the atmosphere, which is one that looks at how we give negative feedback or criticism in different parts of the world. And I'm just going to start by giving you an example about a client that I worked with. I had this British guy who was working on a team with this guy from the Netherlands. And the British guy wrote a report, and he sent it to the Dutch guy for feedback. And when the Dutch person received the report, he thought it was horrible. He thought there's no way that we can send this to the client like this. So when the Dutch person called up the British person, he had the value system of the importance of honesty that drove the way he gave the feedback. And he said, you know, I read through your report, and there's no way that we can send this to the client like this. He said the introduction is weak, but here are some things we could do in order to improve the introduction. He said there's a lack of logic flow in the middle of the report, but here are some things we could do in order to improve that logic flow. A number of grammatical errors that I've circled here for you. And as he went through that feedback, the British person was taking this feedback really emotionally. He was thinking, this person is an arrogant jerk, and he doesn't seem to like me very much. He thought, this is the last time that I'm going to ask that person for feedback. Now, if you imagine the tables turn, and in the second situation, it's exactly the opposite. This time, the Dutch guy writes the report. He sends it to the British person who thinks it's horrible, who thinks about how to improve it. But when the British person calls up the Dutch person, he gives the feedback in a different way. So he starts by saying, you know, I read through your report, and there were a number of things about the report that I thought were good. So this section I thought was very well written. This is what I liked about it. This section here I thought was very well researched. This is what I liked. Now, if you wanted to make some changes, I have just a few small suggestions for you. So I was thinking that the introduction to this report could be even stronger with just some small modifications. And the middle of the report could have a very powerful impact with some minor adaptations. There's some very small grammatical errors, no problem at all. I just cleaned those right up, right? Overall, fine. Now, when the Dutch person got this report, this feedback, he took it at face value. He thought the report's pretty good. I'll spend 3 minutes making a few small changes, and then he sent it out to the client. And then he found out a week later from someone else that that British person didn't like the report. And now he thought, this guy is a hypocrite, right? You can't trust him. He lied to me. He thought, this is the last time that I'm going to ask this person for feedback. So when you think about what it means to give constructive feedback, please recognize that that's different from one part of the world to another. Now, when you look at the country positions here, you'll see that some countries have shifted from being to the right-hand side on the last scale, so they are high context cultures, to the left-hand side of this scale. So these are cultures. So these are high context direct cultures. Those are cultures where we speak between the lines a lot. We read the air a lot. But if it comes to giving a negative message, we're much more likely to use what I call upgraders, which are words that make the negative message feel stronger, such as, this is absolutely inappropriate, or this is totally unacceptable. In more indirect cultures, we use more downgraders, like you might possibly think about doing this a little bit differently, maybe, right? Now, another thing you might notice is that some of the countries have shifted from being low context to more middle on this scale. So the US, the lowest context culture in the world, very focused on recapping key points, putting things in writing, clear as possible in all situations except when it comes to giving negative feedback. And at that moment, Americans have been taught to give 3 positives with every negative, to catch people doing things right, to do positive anchoring, which means if I have to tell you your work is not okay, I should start by telling you what I like about your work, which shows respect, before I tell you what to do differently. And I think now you can understand what happened to poor Sabine. I mean, Sabine, who comes from a country, France, where positive feedback is given less frequently and less strongly. Negative feedback is given more strongly. So when she went into that performance review with John, and John started by giving her those 3 positives, she thought to herself, wow, this is the best performance review I've ever received. When he got to the real message, she wasn't even listening anymore. Now, I also wanted to make a quick comment here as you're looking at the US and France about our education systems, which is, of course, where this all starts. And I told you I have these 2 little boys, Ethan and Logan, and I brought them this summer. So they were born in France. They've always lived in France. And I brought them this summer to Minnesota. They're there right now, to Minnesota, so that they could learn how to read and write in English. And I just see the way they're bathed differently. So in the US, when Ethan comes home from school, he shows me his paper, and his American teachers have written things like, excellent work, exclamation mark. They put stars and smiley faces, fantastic, right? And when he doesn't do well, they write things like, you're almost there. A little more effort, you're on your way. And I can tell you, it is not like this in France. So in France, when Ethan takes this dictation test on Monday, all week long he prepares. It gets to be Monday, he takes the test, he comes home, he shows me the paper. There's always red marks all over it. And the teacher will have written things like, applique-toi, exclamation mark, which means apply yourself. Or she will have written NA, which means skills not acquired. And when I see this research, it hurts me. I think, oh, he's going to lose his self-esteem. He's not going to want to go to school anymore. But I'm the one having culture shock. Ethan, he understands the feedback in the context it's received. Mom, what's the big deal? I had the 5th best paper in the class, right? So I know you're not managing 9-year-olds, but I do believe that this feedback teaches us to have a tougher skin or a more sensitive skin later on in life. Okay, we went through these first 2 scales already. I'd like to wrap up now quickly with our 3rd scale. In some cultures, one person talks and another person talks at the same time, right? In these cultures, if we talk simultaneously, it shows I'm very passionate. We have a great relationship. Everything's going well. In that first category, I would put Latin cultures, Mediterranean cultures, Arabic cultures, some African cultures. The second pattern, these are what we call perfect timing cultures. In these cultures, we talk like we play ping pong. We don't like overlap, and we don't like silence. And I would put Anglo-Saxon countries, including the US, as well as Germanic cultures, into this pattern. And the third pattern is one that looks more like this, where one person might speak, and then there's a pause before the next person responds. And I think I would put all East Asian countries into this third pattern. So you can see now what happened to poor Bo Chen, right? If you have people from all three of these cultures working together, the third group loses because they're waiting for that moment to speak that never comes, right? When I worked with Bo, he said, I'm so frustrated, Erin. I go to these meetings, I'm all prepared. No one ever gives me a moment to speak, right? We can work on that when we're leading a global team by inviting people to speak, giving them a clear moment, recognizing that we are responsible for giving everyone the opportunity. Thank you.